Why the avoidant struggles more after than the anxious does. We often assume that the person who clings, cries, or begs for closure is the one who suffers the most after a breakup. But what if I told you that the person who seems the most composed, the one who pulled away, needed space, or couldn't commit, is often the one who suffers longer and deeper after the fact? Let's talk about why the avoidant struggles more after than the anxious does. You see, the anxious person processes pain in real time. They feel everything as it's happening. They ask questions, seek reassurance, and try to fix what's breaking, often with overwhelming intensity. But in doing that, they're dealing with the emotions up front. They're facing the storm head on. The avoidant, on the other hand, doesn't feel it right away because they won't let themselves. They intellectualize, they compartmentalize, they say things like, "I just need space," or "This doesn't feel right anymore," and then walk away, relieved to no longer feel pressured. But here's the catch: space is only peaceful until it turns into emptiness. And once the anxious person starts to heal, once they accept the loss, rediscover their worth, and begin to rebuild, the avoidant is just beginning to notice the silence. And then it hits the comfort, the closeness, the quiet love they pushed away. It wasn't suffocating. It was safe. The tragedy is that by the time they realize this, the anxious person has often grown past the point of returning. That's why the avoidant suffers more after. This isn't about you not, because they don't just miss the person. They have to confront the choices that led to losing them. The anxious partner experiences emotional pain in real time. From the moment they sense distance or disconnection, their nervous system goes into overdrive. They feel it in their chest, their stomach, their thoughts, their sleep. It consumes them. This is not because they're weak or needy. It's because their attachment system is highly sensitive to perceived threats of abandonment. The moment something feels off, they don't just worry, they panic. And in that panic, they begin trying to repair, to reach out, to hold on tighter. They ask questions, send messages, have long conversations, and rehearse every word and action in their mind to understand what went wrong. For the anxious person, the pain is immediate. It comes with confusion, desperation, and often a deep sense of shame. They might feel like they're too much, or that their need for reassurance pushed the other person away. And because they feel it so deeply, they often don't try to hide it. They vent to friends. They read articles, watch videos, journal, or even seek therapy. They do all the things that help them process. And even though the pain is intense, even they may feel like they're drowning, they are actively working through their grief. Every tear, every sleepless night, every overanalyzed message is a step in the grieving process. It's messy, but it's movement. Contrast this with the avoidant. When the same relationship starts to show cracks, the avoidant doesn't feel panic. They feel discomfort and then relief. Relief that the pressure to connect or show vulnerability is lifting. Relief that they don't have to explain what they can't quite articulate. So they step back, close off, or sometimes abruptly cut ties. From the outside, they appear calm, collected, even cold. It may seem like they've moved on, like the breakup didn't touch them at all. But what's actually happening is emotional postponement. They're not processing. It's not that they've healed. It's that they've avoided the wound entirely. While the anxious person is breaking down, questioning their worth, and rebuilding piece by piece, the avoidant has simply pressed pause. And because they've paused their emotional response, they don't grow from the experience right away. They don't look inward. They don't question what role their fear of intimacy might have played. They don't confront the guilt or the sadness or the missed opportunities. At least, not until much later. But the anxious, because of their pain, starts doing the emotional work right away. They learn, they reflect, they try to understand their patterns, and slowly, painfully, they begin to heal. This doesn't mean the anxious person has an easy time, far from it. But their healing has a timeline. It starts early, and even though it's exhausting, it's linear. The avoidance healing, on the other hand, often comes when the silence becomes louder than the connection ever was. And by then, the anxious person is often long gone. Stronger, wiser, not wiser, and less willing to be with someone who couldn't meet them in the middle. Avoidants often experience a profound sense of relief when they step away from a relationship, especially one that challenged their emotional boundaries or made them feel vulnerable. To them, space feels like control. It's a return to safety, a place where they're no longer required to explain themselves or deal with emotions that make them uncomfortable. This relief isn't fake, it's real. The anxious partner's closeness may have felt overwhelming to them. They may have interpreted emotional intensity as pressure or needness. So when they create distance, it feels like the pressure lifts. They can breathe again. In those early days post-breakup, the avoidant may genuinely believe they made the right decision. That space is soothing at first because it establishes their emotional independence. They're not used to relying on others, and they may even see emotional interdependence as a weakness. So, after the separation, they go back to their routines, their habits, their solitude. They may even look content, post pictures, go out, or appear completely unaffected. From the outside looking in, it seems like they've moved on quickly, but in reality, what they're experiencing is temporary peace, a false calm that's born from avoidance, not resolution. The problem arises when space, over time, transforms from freedom and elation. The silence that once felt comforting begins to echo. The lack of text, the absence of shared moments, the quiet after what was once daily connection, it all starts to register. And not just as silence, but as loss. That's when the avoidant starts to feel the impact of the breakup, but they're now weeks or months behind the anxious partner who has already cried, grieved, and started to accept what happened. The avoidant delayed their pain, and because of that, it often hits harder when it finally arrives. What's especially challenging is that avoidants don't always know how to name what they're feeling. They're used to suppressing or dismissing emotion, so when loneliness creeps in, they don't immediately recognize it as grief. They may say, "I miss the routine," or "it feels quiet lately," without realizing that what they actually miss is the connection, the warmth of having someone care, check in, and share life with them. That's when the peace of solitude starts to crack. What felt like a safe retreat begins to feel like emotional exile. By the time this shift happens, the anxious partner may have already begun to detach emotionally. They may still think about the avoidant, but they've had time to reflect, to talk, grow. The avoidant, meanwhile, is only just starting to understand what they gave up. And because avoidants often struggle with emotional articulation, they may not know how to express this realization. That inner conflict, missing someone but feeling incapable of reaching out in a meaningful way, leads to further regret and confusion. What started as peaceful space becomes an emotional vacuum, filled with thoughts of what might have been, if only they had stayed present long enough to see the value of the connection before it slipped away. The anxious individual experiences emotional pain intensely and immediately, but that very intensity forces them into a kind of emotional reckoning that many avoidants never face, at least not right away. From the moment the relationship begins to falter, the anxious partner is already in the process of grieving. They may not call it that, and it certainly doesn't feel like healing in the beginning. In fact, it often feels like complete emotional chaos. But what's really happening is that the anxious person is processing, feeling every layer of the pain, cycling through it, and ultimately working through it step by step. When someone is anxiously attached, their natural instinct is to seek closeness when threatened. So, when a relationship starts to fall apart, their reaction is not withdrawal, but pursuit. They try to understand, they ask questions, they cry, plead, overthink, and sometimes overreach. And while that can sometimes be messy or misunderstood, it's also honest. They don't bottle it up or pretend it doesn't hurt. They admit it hurts. They face the emotional weight of the loss head on. And in doing that, they begin, consciously or not, the difficult but necessary work of healing. This is why anxious individuals, despite often being portrayed as weaker or more emotionally fragile, can actually become some of the emotionally resilient over time. Their healing process may be dramatic, but it's active. Every sleepless night spent crying is also a night spent reflecting. Every conversation they have with a friend, every journal entry, every therapy session, every self-help video, they are all steps forward, even if it doesn't feel like progress at the time. Through this painful process, they begin to learn not just about the relationship that ended, but about themselves. They confront their patterns, their triggers, and their needs. They grow. Avoidants, on the other hand, often delay or deny this growth. Because they avoid emotional confrontation, they also avoid the opportunity to evolve emotionally in the immediate aftermath. While the anxious person is doing the hard inner work of healing, the avoidant is often leaning into distractions. They may focus on work, hobbies, casual interactions, or anything that allows them to sidestep emotional discomfort. But avoidance isn't healing. This isn't about you not. It's emotional stalling. And although it may preserve their sense of control in the short term, it leaves them vulnerable to unresolved grief in the long run. What gives the anxious person an unexpected advantage is that their pain is unavoidable. Because they feel it so strongly, they have no choice but to face it. And in facing it, they begin to move through it. They come out on the other side with more self-awareness, more emotional depth, and if they truly do the work, a stronger sense of boundaries and self-worth. They begin to see that their value was never tied to how much someone else could give them, but in how deeply they are capable of feeling and how willing they are to grow. The very trait that once caused them to cling becomes the force that empowers them to let go. Avoidants often don't fully register what they've lost until long after the relationship has ended. In the early stages of separation, they may feel a sense of relief. The emotional demands are gone, the pressure to communicate or be vulnerable is lifted, and their world feels simpler. For a while, that simplicity is soothing. But over time, a shift begins to happen, subtle at first. The messages stop coming. There are no check-ins, no reminders of affection, no shared moments. What once felt like space begins to feel like a void. And in that quiet, the avoidant starts to reflect, not just on the absence of the other person, but on what that person represented. This is when many avoidants begin to experience a derealization that the connection they distanced themselves from wasn't as suffocating as they had imagined. It was supportive, comfort you not, comforting real, but by this point, the anxious partner has often already begun to reclaim their emotional energy. In the anxious partner's world, the weeks or months post breakup have been filled with pain, yes, but also with processing. They've cried, talked, journaled, analyzed, and in doing so, they've started to detach. They've begun to accept the loss, and crucially, they've started to change. That transformation is often internal, but it's powerful. It's a shift in how they see themselves and what they're willing to accept. So when the avoidant begins to realize what they had and lost, they're often too late. The anxious partner, who once clung to every shred of connection, may no longer be open to it. They've been through the storm. They've done the inner work. And even if they still some affection or nostalgia, they've come to understand things fundamental. They deserve emotional safety, consistency, and someone who doesn't need to lose them to recognize their value. For the avoidant, this creates a painful emotional dissonance. They may finally feel ready to connect, but the person who once waited for their love is no longer standing still. This isn't just about missing someone. It's about realizing that the door is closing or already closed. And that's where real regret lies. Not lone lies, but in the awareness that they took something for granted. That while they were protecting themselves from discomfort, the other person was giving their all. That while they were pulling away, the other person was trying to hold things together. And now, the anxious partner has nothing left to give. Not because they don't care, but because they finally care about themselves more. This moment of recognition can be jarring. The avoidant is faced with the truth that their defense mechanisms, while helpful in the short term, came at a long-term cost. They avoided pain in the beginning, but now face it without the option of repair. The anxious partner has grown past the point of return, and the avoidant is left not just with absence, but with the knowledge that it didn't have to end this way. Regret is one of the most difficult emotions to live with, not just because of what was lost, but because of the haunting realization that it was preventable. For the avoidant, this regret often arrives late, after the dust has settled, after the anxious partner has moved on, and after the opportunity for reconnection has passed. It's not simply that they miss the person, they miss the version of themselves that could have shown up differently, and the relationship that might have been possible if they had. In the beginning, the avoidant convinced themselves that stepping back is a necessity. They feel overwhelmed, pressured, or misunderstood. To them, creating space is a way of protecting their emotional autonomy. But in the process, they often push away the very thing they subconsciously crave: closeness, trust, intimacy. They justify their distance by focusing on the partner's perceived intensity or needness, never realizing that those very qualities often came from a place of love and a desire to feel connected. When the relationship ends, they don't immediately feel the consequences of their actions. They may even feel a sense of relief or emotional detachment. But time has a way of stripping away those defenses. As the memories soften and the emotional triggers fade, they begin to remember the good, the laughter, the shared moments, the safety of being emotionally seen, even if they didn't know how to receive it at the time. And that's when the deeper realization sets in. They didn't just lose someone, they chose to lose them. Through their avoidance, through their silence, through their refusal to engage emotionally, they created the very outcome they now mourn. This is what makes the avoidance regret so profound. It's not just about missing a person. It's about seeing clearly, often for the first time, how their own patterns and fears contribute to the loss. They realize they had someone who cared, someone who tried, someone who saw them in ways they rarely let themselves be seen. And instead of leaning into it, they pulled away. And now, in the absence of that connection, they're left not only with loneliness, but with accountability. The anxious partner, for all their emotional turmoil, typically walks away with clarity. They may hurt deeply, but they eventually understand what happened. They see where they overextended, where they gave too much, where they lost themselves trying to hold the relationship together. And with that clarity, they start to make better choices for themselves. The avoidant, however, is often left with questions that don't have easy answers. This isn't about you, not why couldn't I let them in? Why did I need to push them away? What was I so afraid of? These are hard questions to sit with. They require emotional honesty and a willingness to face one's own patterns. And perhaps most painfully, they often come too late to change the outcome. The avoidant isn't just grieving a lost relationship. They're grieving the realization that their fear of intimacy cost them something real, and that the only thing standing in the way was their inability to stay present when it mattered most. Thank you for listening today, whether you're someone who loves deeply, avoids connection, or is trying to understand the patterns that have shaped your relationships. Awareness is the first step to change. And if nothing else, I hope this has helped you see that the way we feel doesn't define us, but what we do with those feelings absolutely can. Take care of yourself, be kind to your heart, and remember, healing doesn't always look graceful, but it's always worth the effort. Thank you so much for being here. Goodbye for now, and I wish you strength and love on your journey.